pleasure here today to introduce a new colleague of mine in the Department of Geography, Dr. Katherine Nelson. She comes to us from Vanderbilt University, where she earned a PhD in environmental engineering. She's currently teaching our introductory GIS class, Geography 508, GIS 1. More classes to come in the future, I suppose. But just a little bit about her research. And I checked out her webpage, so I got this right, hopefully, here this morning. She conducts inter- and transdisciplinary research that focuses on analysis of social structures that interact with the built and natural environment to promote or harm social equity, ecological and human health, and long-term viability of social environmental systems. And she's here today to talk about flooding. Just one bit, some of her recent publications have appeared in journals like Water Resources Research, Applied Geography Risks, and the Journal of the Transportation Research Board. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Nelson.
Okay, and thank you for inviting me to come and talk to you guys. So I'm just going to give kind of a high-level overview, talk a little bit about some of the challenges that we face when we're thinking about what are the problems with urban flooding issues, and how can we respond to these challenges, what can we do to mitigate our damages and reduce the impacts. And then I'll talk a little bit more in depth about one specific case that I've done a little bit of work on. These images happen to come from the Nashville Public Library. They have a big collection of pictures that, from the May 2010 floods that occurred in Nashville. I'm most recently from Nashville, so a lot of what I talk about today will be about the Nashville flood. Let's see if I can get my thing to work. Okay, no. There we go. All right, so I think the news cycle nowadays, I feel like we see a lot more information and headlines about big natural disasters across the U.S. Most recently, hurricanes and flooding associated with them, lots of wildfires and stuff. And there's lots of information in the news media about how expensive these disasters are and how much they cost. So this is a nice, ooh, that's not what I wanted. This figure is from NOAA and showing the number of billion-dollar disaster events in the U.S. over time, where the number of disaster events are these colored bars increasing from 1980 to 2018. We see a pretty, there's ups and downs, but it's increasing. From somewhere around 2-3 normally in the 80s, and now we're in the 10s. Last year, I believe, what is that, $16 billion disaster events. And the line here shows the cost associated with those disaster events, which of course corresponds with the number of events we have. And I think last year we had a new high, a new record, about, $370 billion in natural disasters is the preliminary estimate, right? So it's probably actually more than that. And we look at this, they attribute this to several different types of natural hazards. Hurricanes are the yellow category, tropical cyclones, things like Superstorm Sandy would also be included within that. We have blue, our inland flooding. One thing I'll point out about this blue, it doesn't look like very many of these events are flooding events. However, a lot of these other events that are in here also have flooding that occurs as part of that event. So hurricanes, we also often see a lot of flooding associated with those. Okay. And of course, this is not just in the US, but also around the world. We've seen some increases in the number of damaging natural disaster events, really damaging natural disaster events, and the costs of those. Perhaps more concerning is the amount in blue shows the amount that's uninsured of the damage from these natural disasters. So you can see that we have a significant portion of this that is not insured. We don't have the financial capability to deal with these. So why do we have this, looks like a pretty convincing trend going up? Maybe it's weather and climate. So maybe we actually have more severe weather events, more severe disasters. Maybe they're more frequent. If we think about climate change science, we say, well, maybe so. We might actually expect more frequent and more severe weather. But really over this time period, what we can attribute to climate change, I think, really should be a fairly small portion. So there's other things that are going on here that are leading to this increase. And of course, remember, this is only the billion-dollar disaster events. This doesn't account for all the other smaller events that happen more frequently and regularly as well. So if we just think about climate and weather patterns, we know we've had increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. We've had increasing global temperatures. And the temperatures then are related to our precipitation patterns, which is why we care about them when we're thinking about these flooding issues. So if we look at just the historic record in the US from early 1900s to 2010, looking at monthly precipitation totals, we see maybe a very, very slight increase, maybe. It's not particularly significant. But if we're thinking about global, we believe in the climate models that are projecting increasing temperatures, we might expect this to continue, this slight increase over time. Of course, that was just for the entire US. We average it across space for the US. And we have variations across the globe as well. So in some places, maybe this average precipitation amount is decreasing, in other places increasing. In the US, the climate models suggest that we're kind of in a good spot right here. We're around 0, so relatively minor changes. Now that's just mean. This is our average precipitation though. So what's perhaps more concerning is that these climate models suggest that the extremes, these outlier type events, are perhaps going to be more frequent, perhaps more severe. And that's really what is changing as we change the climate. That's what's changing the most. And so we see regions of the US now start to pop up a little higher on this scale. And we don't have to just look at the climate models. That can tell us something about maybe how it's going to change in the future. But let's look at the observed record. And so we can look at the annual precipitation in only the heaviest rainfall events from 1901 to 2016. And we see percent increase, significant increases over most of the US, meaning these most severe rainstorm events are even more severe now than they were in the early 1900s. Okay? So these bad rainstorms are dropping more water. Okay, but also, if we look at precipitation trends, again, observed records, 1910 to 2010, this is looking at the amount of precipitation events, one-day precipitation events, that are considered to be extreme, so in that high category. And perhaps there's some variability, of course, but we've seen recently a lot more of these, lot more frequent severe rainstorm events. Okay? So we're increasing, we have some evidence to suggest that these rainstorms are getting more severe and they're more frequent. Okay. Which means we're probably going to have a lot more flash flood types of conditions, flashy conditions, right? Lots of water in short periods of time. And it's going to happen more frequently. Okay, but that, I mean, you can look at these trends. Most of it's fairly small changes, so that can't account for these really big, huge increases in the amount of the cost of damages that we've been seeing. So there's other things going on. One of them is development trends, so urbanization. So since 1900, the population in the US has grown about 5-fold. And where we used to have more than 50% of the population being rural population, we now have only 15% is rural. Rural populations have been fairly flat, and urban populations have climbed, which means we have more people in these kind of condensed urban areas. And of course, our urban areas are almost always built around streams, rivers, coastlines, right? When you founded a city, you needed there to be a source of water. It was for drinking water, it was for sanitation purposes, it was perhaps livelihoods, fishing, and transportation, right? So most of our major cities are built up around these kind of watery areas, which means now we have a lot more people condensed in these areas where we would expect to have flood risks. Okay, at the same time too, we've had a shift in lifestyles and in quality of life expectations that has changed how these urban areas have developed. So not only do we need to be able to make room for more people in these urban areas, but how we make room and how much room we need to make has changed. So since the 40s, we've seen that the average household size in the US has decreased in size from 3.5 to somewhere around 2.5 today, right? Which means for the same amount of people, we now need more homes. Okay? Simultaneously, we've been seeing an increase in the average household size. People now expect to have more space for their families. So just from the 70s to 2009, you saw an increase of about 1,000 square foot per average single-family home. Okay, so think about, we've got all this population now in these urban areas, so we were going to need more homes anyway, but now we have fewer people living together, so we need even more homes, and all of those homes are going to be larger than they used to be. What this means is then we have to make space for these homes. We are converting the natural land cover in these urban areas to roads and parking lots and rooftops, right? At an increasingly fast pace. So if we think about kind of how we're changing land cover with these urbanization patterns, we can see there's been pretty significant increases in the amount of developed area across the US. So from 2001 to 2011, we see increases in all categories of developed space across the US. Let's see, medium intensity is somewhere around 8,000 square kilometers. Very large areas. So this is, again, things like parking lots, residential neighborhoods, industrial complexes. So we have a lot more of our landscape is now covered with these instead of with forests and grasslands and wetlands. And why do we care about that? Just thinking about floods, in the context of floods, when we take out a forest and we put in a parking lot, we're increasing the amount of surface runoff we would have in a precipitation event. So the rainfall now, instead of falling into the vegetation and into the soil and being soaked up by that soil, being taken up by the roots of the plants, instead of that water that's on the surface being slowed down, its actual physical movement, its speed being slowed down by the vegetation that it's flowing along, what we have is a parking lot, and the water falls on it and it sheds right off. It cannot soak into the ground, right? So we have more standing water now, and a lot of times it's moving faster. So just this change in the developed area from 2001 to 2011, we see a change in the average annual runoff volume, somewhere about 3 billion cubic meters. Okay? So it's a lot of water. It's a lot of water. And so when you have a lot more water then that you have to deal with that isn't being soaked up naturally into the ground, you exacerbate your flooding conditions when you have these high rainfall events. It leads to increasing flash flood conditions. And of course, development patterns vary across the US as everywhere else, but we see a lot of the places that are experiencing the most rapid change are in urban areas: Oklahoma City, Little Rock, Atlanta, Nashville, Phoenix. And so these areas, they're converting a lot of that natural land cover to developed areas. So if we put that together, we think there's evidence that suggests that we have and will have in the future more frequent extreme precipitation events. We're also going to have more people and more structures condensed in these urban areas that are often near rivers and streams where we would expect to have flooding conditions anyway. We're going to have more impervious cover, so we're going to produce more runoff when we have storm events. And so if we're already in sort of a flood condition from a river, then we're adding more water to that's shedding off of our roadways. We're just increasing the flooding issues. So we're going to have worse flooding, more frequent flooding probably, and more impacts. So I'll just present a kind of a few examples here. So Houston, Hurricane Harvey last year. So the hurricane, most of the damage from Harvey was not due to hurricane winds, at least not in the Houston area, maybe on the coast. Hurricane Harvey was so devastating because it just it stalled, and it sat right on top of Houston, and it dumped 40 inches of rain in 4 days. It's a lot of water, right? So you had flash flooding throughout the city. You had neighborhoods just completely inundated. This was a highway, is a highway, right? And unfortunately, because of the urban development in the area that's led to these more impervious cover and more runoff, we've had more severe flash flood conditions. So it's not necessarily so much that the rivers are flooding in the streams. They did. But on top of that, we also have all this flooding that's occurring just from the stormwater runoff, right? Because 50% of the flooding that occurred was not in what we'd normally consider to be high-risk flood zone areas. FEMA makes these flood zone maps, right? They're based off of river and stream flooding models. So it doesn't take into account these flash flood conditions where your road or your highway is suddenly turned into a temporary river. And of course, somewhere around definitely more than 100 billion in damages. It's really hard to quantify this accurately because, like I said, more than 50% of the flooding occurred in places that were not in the high-risk flood zones, which means a lot of these people didn't have flood insurance. So we can't go and look at the claims, the insurance claims, to find out how much damage there was. This is just showing the extent of some of the flooding in Houston. The orangey colors here are the actual FEMA flood zones, and then the blue is everywhere that had standing water that could be remotely sensed. So we can see, yeah, we have standing water in these flood zone areas, but we also have it just all over the place, right? Nashville, May 2010, got about 13 inches of rain in 48 hours. This is classified as a 1,000-year storm event. And again, we saw both river flooding and stream flooding, as well as flash flooding. So this picture is downtown, and the Cumberland River runs right here. So the Cumberland River definitely was above flood stage, and it spilled out over, even there's some levees here, into downtown. But this is just a highway, right? So, and the highway itself served as a corridor for water to move along, and so you had a lot of runoff accumulating on the roadways. So by my own calculations, about 40% of the flooding occurred outside of these high-risk flood zones. And the initial estimates were somewhere around $2 billion in personal property damages. And Nashville is one of those places where I think there's probably a lot of concern about future flooding risks like this because it is growing at an astronomical rate. There's huge amounts of development. Some people in the city will brag about having the most cranes of any city in the US, right? And it's true, it's really remarkable to see how fast it's growing. But what's happening is they're taking these urban cores that are near, say, the Cumberland River, and there's several tributaries, and they're densifying. So they're taking out smaller homes on large lots, empty wooded lots, grassy lots, and they're tearing those down, and they're putting up 4 large houses with a lawn or a green space about the size of a postage stamp, right? And this is happening across the city. So we're going to expect probably a lot more runoff issues in Nashville in the future that are only going to contribute to flooding issues. Maybe you saw this, Ellicott City. This was earlier this year. This is in Maryland, little smallish town, number of streams running along it. They got 6 inches of rainfall in 3 hours, which is really kind of terrifying. A 1,000-year storm event. And so in the course of 3 hours, they had their streams just rise up over and flow down Main Street. This is Main Street here. And this happened, again, in only a couple of hours. All that water just being carried down these impervious surfaces. Sadly, this is the second one of these events they've had in 2 years. This happened in 2016. And of course, closer to home, Manhattan, Labor Day, 9 inches of rainfall, I think the Corps says, 500-year storm event. And again, we saw Wildcat Creek rising up very quickly. Had a lot of runoff, a lot of it coming from some of the newer developments over on the west side of town, and spilling over a lot of flash flood conditions. Right? Was it 300 people evacuated? And based off the paper you just gave me, about 17 million in damages, it looks like. Yeah. So we've got a lot of examples here of urban areas where there's been a lot of development, and we have these severe rainstorm events that are then compounded by increasing amounts of runoff, lead to really, really severe flooding events with lots of damages associated with them. So historically, I guess our approach to resolving flood issues has been kind of hard engineering dams and levees. So this shows all the levees from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers database. You can see we have lots of levees, these big earthen embankments on the sides of rivers. The idea is just to protect what's on the other side of the levee, right? So we have these along the Mississippi, the Ohio, all over the U.S. Dams as well, where the idea is to then regulate water flow to something downstream to protect a downstream asset, right? The problem with our dams and levees, one of the problems is that we're transferring some of the risk. So with a dam, you're protecting downstream assets by holding water upstream and regulating the flow downstream. But when you have severe weather events, sometimes that means that the upstream communities could be more at risk. Okay? And of course, dams are built to certain specifications. A lot of our structures are built to, say, withstand a 100-year storm event. And I think everything I showed you just then was recent memory, right? And those are all greater than a 100-year storm event. So if we have conditions that exceed it, there's no guarantee that that's going to protect you. In fact, they can fail and make things even catastrophically worse. Levees also transfer risk. They protect what's on the immediate side of the levee, but because they're narrowing the river channel and not allowing the stream to expand when it becomes swollen with more water, you have a lot more water that's carried downstream at a faster rate. So those downstream communities can sometimes be more at risk. This is just showing a levee segment in Memphis, Tennessee. So here's the Mississippi River. And the blue area here shows you what is protected by the levee, right? So this is the area that we would expect to be inundated or flooded if there was a 100-year storm event. That is not, because the levee is there. So as you can see, though, when they built this levee, there was probably nothing here. People now, they go, oh, there's a levee there. It's safe. And they move in. We now have development all the way up to the very wall of the levee. So what happens if they have, say, a 200-year storm event? All this stuff is flooded. It's about, I think, 28,000 people, $2 billion worth of assets. Right? So sometimes we build these things and we feel protected, but it's only minimizing our risk. It doesn't remove it entirely. The Barker Reservoir, this is in the Houston area. So in 1940s, there was flooding in Houston, downtown Houston. And so they decided, we're going to build a reservoir. We're going to build an earthen dam. We're going to regulate flows from this stream to downtown Houston to protect downtown. So we have an earthen embankment here and a dam. And there's just a little stream here, kind of a little ponding reservoir area. So, and over the years, people started building their homes closer and closer to the backside of this reservoir. And of course, right up against the front side as well, on the other side of the dam. And what happened in Harvey is we had such extreme conditions, more than this was designed for, that we saw the reservoir filling up in all these neighborhoods on the back, completely flooded. And even though the flows down to downtown Houston were being regulated, Harvey was so intense that it exceeded the design capacity of the dam. There was overtopping, and you have a lot of homes in the neighborhoods just downstream of the dam that were also flooded. Despite that feeling of, oh, I'm safe, there's a dam here. Right? Okay, what else do we do? Gray infrastructure. Of course, one of the main ways we deal with particularly like urban runoff. Right? So the stormwater systems, you have your piping from your stormwater sewers, pumping stations, storage tanks. So in some places they're building these great big tanks that are holding peak flows, and they just store them there until, say, your rainfall event has subsided, your river levels have lowered, and then they slowly release that water. This is an example of one in Nashville. Actually, there's two. This is an older one, and this is a brand new one. Holds 21 million gallons, I believe. It's 37 feet tall, 260 feet in diameter. It's a really, really massive tank. The problem with these things, of course, they're expensive to build. They take a lot of work to maintain, and you have to upgrade them as well. Especially if you think, oh, we'll just expand in our stormwater sewer system. We'll put bigger pipes in that it'll be able to carry more water, right? So then that should help with some of our runoff issues. To go and change every single pipe throughout town would be astronomically expensive. So a lot of communities are moving towards green infrastructure, things that will kind of soak up some of the water in a more natural way. Green roofs, permeable pavement, bioswales, so rain garden type things. Tree planting and rain barrels. The problems with these is that then a lot of times you need a large area, a lot of area to soak these things up. And in some urban areas, that's just not possible, right? Space is at a premium. The other problem is, say, things like rain barrels. It's very distributed. It's hard to maintain. You can't just send one guy out to check on the rain barrels. That's more of each individual homeowner has to purchase one, set it up, and make sure that it's working properly. Okay. Insurance. So this isn't really getting rid of the problem. This is just being financially prepared, right? So Congress in the 60s mandated the creation of the National Flood Insurance Program because most homeowners and renters insurance policies won't cover flood insurance. It's expensive, right? It's hard to calculate the risk because on it, and it's not really worth it to insurers. So they created this program. There's about 5 million active flood insurance policies in 2018. Anybody who buys a home using a typical mortgage in a 100-year floodplain or in a floodplain is technically required to purchase flood insurance. Okay? Unfortunately, there are ways to get around this though, and you'll find that people, maybe they'll get it initially and then they kind of drop out of the program as well. So it's sort of required, but only for that 100-year floodplain. And remember, a lot of our flooding isn't even in the floodplains, right? And it's kind of sort of mandatory. So this is showing insurance enrollments in the NFIP in Texas, Harris County, where Houston is. And you see, I'm absolutely sure that there is not a decrease in the number of homes in that floodplain over this time period, the 2008 to 2014. However, we see a decrease in the number of people enrolled. So people are saying, nothing's happened. I don't need this anymore. And they drop the flood insurance. So one, we don't have enough people enrolled, so we have a small pool. It's very expensive, and this program operates at a 1.4 billion loss every year. Every year. In addition, say you do have NFIP. There is no guarantee that you're going to get enough money back from the insurance company to, say, rebuild your entire home, right? The average payment in Kansas for an NFIP claim is about $20,000. I'm pretty sure that's not even close to covering most of the damages. All right, so a lot of communities now are turning towards home buyouts. It's a pretty popular thing now. This is, again, funded by FEMA, typically through the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. You can also get some money from HUD, I believe. But since the 1990s, early 1990s, FEMA has given $4 billion to communities for the acquisition and demolition of homes in high-risk flood areas. $4 billion. They go in, they find these high-risk flood homes, they demolish them, and they return them to a more natural state. Maybe they turn it into a wetland or a rain garden area. Maybe they just have a lawn, grass, but a more permeable kind of surface. Communities have to apply for this. There's a special application. And they're required to put up about 25% of the funds to do this, right? Typically, you only see communities getting this after they've had a major disaster. There's been a presidential disaster declaration. And then they can go to FEMA and be like, oh, this is so bad. Help us so that we don't have this much damage in the future. And so FEMA will give some money to help support these buyouts. Let's just take the case of Houston. So there are some more than 200,000 homes in the 100-year flood zone. Let's say we want to buy out 50% of those, just 50%, and average cost $200,000 buyout. You have to give the homeowners a fair price. That's, what's that, $20 billion? $20 billion. They've funded only $4 billion since 1990, right? And I think the Houston area, I believe their budget for home buyouts is $44 million right now, so post-Harvey. So it's really, really, really expensive to do these home buyouts. They would work great. They would remove tons of problems, but they're really expensive. Regardless, so I'll talk a little bit now about Nashville area. So I've done some work here, and again, Nashville, they had this big flood back in 2010, 11 fatalities, 11,000 approximately damaged structures. And the Nashville Metro Water Service, they realized, the planners in that office realized, well, we have a problem here with urban flooding, and we're going to continue to have a problem, and we need to do something about this. We need to get rid of these homes that keep flooding over and over. So since 1979, they've actually had a buyout program. It's been relatively small, though, because they haven't been able to get much funding from FEMA because they hadn't had a huge disaster. Right? So prior to 2010, they'd done 102 buyouts. Of course, after 2010, they said, oh, this is really bad. Now please help us, and FEMA gave a more significant amount of change, and they've done 263 additional purchases. So they're going in, they're targeting repetitive loss homes, these homes that flood again and again, and they remove them, they convert them to green space. In some places, they've allowed it to go back to natural vegetated cover. In some places, they've turned them into parks. And the cost for this is about $43 million. But it's kind of hard to quantify some of the benefits of what the program. And they were wondering, well, what good did these 102 parcels do for us before the flood, right? And maybe, how could we have done it better? If we had been able to purchase all of these, would we have, is that a good thing? Should we try and do it more sooner? So I sat down with people at Metro Water, and they said, okay, we have a few questions here. What we want to know is, what would the consequences of not doing the buyout program have been? So what value did those buyouts they did before 2010 provide to the community? And what if we'd been able to do everything we wanted? Because they have this huge wish list of homes. What if we'd been able to do everything before the flood? Preventative is prevention instead of responding, right? But really, their goal is to reduce the amount of damage that Nashville sees when there's a flood event. What they're doing in the long term, is that really going to help? Is that working? And if not, what else can they do? So we're able to get a lot of information from the city. We used tax information, footprints. They had observed flooding depths. And then we used the depth damage functions that are employed in HAZUS, which is FEMA's hazard analysis software, which is kind of the standard for damage and loss estimation. And we estimated the flood damage. So we see that my estimate for the damage, if you remember, the initial estimates were about $2 billion in private property damage. When you look at it on like a per building basis, the entire thing, and we're thinking about not just the structure, but the contents of the structure, and the price of people having to relocate temporarily, all that labor cost with rebuilding, that comes out to somewhere around $3.5 billion. Okay. And by doing those 102 buyouts before 2010, we believe they've saved about almost $6 million. Okay, that's not nearly as big as 3.5 billion, but it's something. We do know that for every dollar they spent on buyouts, they're saving about 80 cents in damages avoided during that 2010 flood. So they're almost getting an even match here. And this is only one flood event. So these are repetitive loss homes. So you can imagine if we think into the future, maybe $1.80, that's probably not so bad. That 80 cents is going to add up over time and be more. They also were able to increase their natural land cover and reduce the amount of runoff, such that if you try to offset management of that runoff using, say, gray infrastructure, it would probably cost you somewhere around $1 million to do it. Okay. In addition, they removed some people from harm's way, including a third of those who we estimate that they removed from harm's way were senior citizens, which is important because, let's see, I think 8 out of those 11 fatalities were all senior citizens. Okay? So they're helping take care of some of the vulnerable population. All right, what if they'd been able to do more before the flood? So if they'd done more than 300 buyouts before, everything that they've managed to do now, for every dollar they spent on buyouts, they would have saved $1.12 just during that one flood event, right? Long term, if we think like a 75-year time horizon, that could add up to be a benefit cost ratio of about 4 to 1. Not so bad. And almost 700 people would be out of harm's way. So you're reducing some of your health and safety risks from the flood. Okay, but in the long run, is it effective at reducing that net total for the Nashville area? I don't know. Well, so if I look, my black lines over here show me the number of buildings, assets that would have been flooded. If I had had that 2010 flood in every single year, how many buildings would have been flooded? The solid line shows me my if no buyouts had occurred, and then we have dashed lines for those two kind of buyout scenarios. And so we say, okay, we're going to have, it looks like over time when we do the buyouts, we have, looks like a lasting reduction in the number of buildings that are damaged. Okay, makes sense because Nashville has development restrictions for the 100-year floodplain. If they got rid of that, it would be a different story. However, if they're worried about more people being exposed and safety issues associated with that, we see that because of the explosive growth in population in the Nashville area, regardless of what they do with buyouts, we're always going to expect the amount of people exposed is going to increase. You have fewer people when you do the buyouts, but you still have a lot more people over time, and you should expect that to increase. Okay. If we just think about the dollar associated with damages, if we had a flood, say, in every year, the same flood happened, would it have been any different, right? Solid line is if we had had no buyouts, and you see, the number of buildings being flooded isn't changing, but these damages are changing. That's because the housing market is fluctuating, and so the values of the homes are changing. Right? And so, of course, we reduce our damages with these buyout scenarios here. But because it's so dependent on the property values, the amount of damage, and in a place like Nashville where you have such explosive growth, you're seeing huge increases in property values. I mean, 100% increase over 3 years, right? You can be pretty much assured that your long-term reductions in this damage due to your buyout are not going to be less than what you experienced in 2010. So you aren't dropping really your value. You're reducing what you'll have in the future, but you're not able to get it below what you already had. Not based on a buyout program of this size. And then finally, because there's so much development, the continued increases in this cover are really outpacing any sort of benefits you're producing in the buyout program in terms of creating green space. So we're still going to have more runoff. You're going to have exacerbated flooding conditions. Yeah. Unfortunately, too, we see there's a few other things we might think about with the buyout program. One of the side effects is that it is actually projected to increase renter populations in the high-risk flood areas. Why do I care? Because renter populations are at higher risk for water rescues, for whatever reason. So they'll be in a greater emergency response burden. We also could say that it looks like at a lot of these buyout locations that are creating parks, it's increasing the value of the homes that are right near these areas. However, they're still pretty high flood risk, right? So, this is a water rescue. If these homes flood in the future, your damages are going to be kind of relatively higher than you would have expected anyway. And I think the biggest thing, though, is really the buyout program actually presents something of a social justice issue. So talking with the people at Metro Water who were talking to the people they're trying to get to participate in the program, a lot of these people had very limited prospects after. There are a lot of people on low income and fixed income, a lot of people who lived there their entire lives and had no other family anywhere else. And who couldn't afford, based off a low, Metro Water can't afford to pay you full market value, right? you can't afford to go and purchase a home in the same place. A lot of them are now moving to a rental property, maybe that's an hour's commute away. All right, so what's the takeaway buyouts? They work, they're cost-effective, good cost-benefit ratio. But if you really want to make them work, you can't wait for FEMA funds after the flood. You've got to take care of it quickly, right now, as a preventative measure. And it's just too costly to be standalone. So some other strategies, home elevation. Some homeowners are asked to do this on their own. It's pretty expensive, though. Development restrictions are actually a good one, right? So don't allow people to build in the 100-year floodplain anymore, right? No new development. Or have freeboard requirements. So Nashville actually has a freeboard requirement. This says any development built in the 100-year floodplain after 1979 had to have a first floor elevation 4 feet above the 100-year flood level. Our preliminary estimates suggest that that saved $2 billion during that 2010 flood. That's a huge saving at almost no cost to the city. And of course, then runoff management type of regulations be really helpful as well at kind of trying to contain the issues. And then, of course, combination of green and gray infrastructure as well. All right, that's all I got, and we're pretty much out of time. Oh, we got.
Maybe a couple questions for anybody?
Yeah.
Do you know if, I know that Manhattan has this problem, but like in the apartments near Wildcat Creek, if you're a renter, are you required to, sorry, if you're a landlord, are you required to tell your renters your floodplain?
You know, I'm not sure that you are. I doubt it. Well, and it might be one of those required but rarely comes across kind of things. And actually in Nashville, you saw that a lot. Some people decided not to sell their homes to the buyout program. They fixed it up and they rent it out. Yeah.
One of the things that wasn't mentioned is the concept of looking at the property being developed and having a stormwater charge related to the area that's associated with the impervious surfaces on that lot. And through that, advocating rain gardens and rain barrels and various things to reduce the amount of water that runs off the lot. And
right.
Have you looked at this issue at all?
No, I think I would consider that part of like a stormwater runoff type of regulation. So having a surcharge for the amount of stormwater runoff you're producing that then goes into, say, some city fund for dealing with this. I haven't done any work on that. One of the reasons in Nashville, you can't suggest tax anything. But you can tell developers you need to have enough rain barrels or permeable pavement to offset the new impervious surface you are going to be creating with this new development. And they have that now, but it's only for the 100-year floodplain, which means everybody's building just on the other side of that little invisible boundary that's the 100-year floodplain.
Well, you need it for everybody in the watershed.
You need it for everybody in the watershed. That's exactly right. Yeah. Yes, because the flood line created by FEMA is not an invisible force field. Yeah.
After a home is bought out and it's turned into a park or whatever green space, who owns that land then?
The city, the government that purchases it. So like in Houston, I think it's actually, it's not the city of Houston itself, it's some sort of, part of their like metro, their flood area control. They would be the owners of that property.
Are there insurances for it not being sold again?
You know, I don't know. I don't know. That might be written into FEMA's grants, but I'm not sure. Yeah.
You see a lot of developers willing to do sustainable parking lots or permeable pavement?
Oh, do
Or-
I
or-
see?
or-
Have
or
I
they-
seen?
Or they pushing back saying they don't
Oh,
really
no,
want to do that?
no. Yeah, at least in Nashville, no way. Only if you twist their arm, and then they will do everything they can to try and bend the rules just a little bit. I'm not in the 100-year floodplain because I created this little embankment that's going to protect this little area. Those kind of things.
So they just have tunnel vision, they see what they want.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
Even though it's beneficial.
It's not beneficial to their pocketbook.
So I have an observation that sort of goes along the same lines. So I'm a soil scientist, and I've seen a common trend with new developers, or new development, developers of new development, I guess, where they will remove all the topsoil from a site, which is pretty common just to, so you don't have to drive over it with machinery when you're building a structure. And then it used to be they would put that topsoil back on the landscape. But what I've seen in the last 20 years or so for that age of development is they will just sell that topsoil, and then they'll put sod directly on the subsoil. And so not only do you have the impermeable surfaces from roofs and driveways and parking lots, but now you have a soil that is much less able to actually allow infiltration to occur. And so you get more runoff from that as well.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a nice way of compounding the problem. And I think even so having a lawn is better than having pavement, obviously, but in comparison to, say, having a wooded area, it's the amount of infiltration, the reduction in runoff is nothing. Yeah. 10, 20%, something along those lines. Yeah. Okay.
All right, I think we are out of time, so let's go ahead and thank Dr. Nelson one more time.